Welcome to EF Pod English. Brought to you by EF Education First and English Town. Learn anytime, anywhere. Pod English, Intermediate 59. Making comparisons.
It's a lot easier to live in the US. I have to be honest with you. If you want to go to US, I tell you. It's kind of hard to get in because there are all these big dudes in the customs and they have big guns and they kind of look in your face and ask you weird questions. But it was a lot easier to live in the US. Japan is a lot of fun. You should go there.
Today we're going to learn how to make comparisons. We'll learn how to do this by adding ER or IER to an adjective. We'll also learn how to make cost comparisons using more and less. And we'll look at how to use better and worse. But first, let's enjoy a movie together. Krista is moving to Japan. She asks the human resources manager for information. Is life in Japan cheaper or more expensive than in the US?
Trust me, it's much more expensive.
So, I know that the cost of living is much higher in Japan than it is here in the US, but I'd like to get a more specific idea since my departure date is approaching.
Well, as a rule of thumb, you can expect to pay roughly twice what you pay here.
Uh-huh. Well, for example, how about housing?
It depends on where you want to live and what kind of accommodations you're looking for, of course. Are you planning to live in downtown Tokyo?
Yes, I've heard that's most convenient, and that it's an easier cultural adjustment.
Okay. For an apartment comparable to yours here in the States, you would pay 40 to 50% more in Tokyo. It would cost less in the suburbs and in rural areas, of course.
I see. Okay. How about food and entertainment?
Food is pricey. You can try to shop around for the best deals, but it's quite a bit more expensive, no matter how you shop. Rice and beer are particularly expensive compared to the US.
Okay, how about entertainment?
Well, here again, the relative cost is very high. It can range from double the cost of the US to... How much do you have?
Well, how about basic entertainment? I'm not talking about formal events or anything. How much does a movie cost?
A movie in a theater costs almost exactly twice the price as a movie in the US.
You're kidding. At this rate, I'm beginning to think it would be better just to stay home.
The cost of living in Japan is much higher than in the US. For instance, my apartment in Tokyo was this big. Oh! With the same amount of money, I can get a much bigger apartment in the US.
So what did you understand? Is life in Japan cheap or expensive? Let's listen to Krista again.
So, I know that the cost of living is much higher in Japan than it is here in the US.
The cost of living is much higher in Japan. One way to make a comparison is to add ER to the end of your adjective. The cost of living in Japan is higher than in the US. The cost of living is lower in the US. Now watch what happens when your adjective ends with the letter Y. That's right, we add IER. Easy, easier. Funny, funnier. Messy, messier. Tidy, tidier. This is easier than I thought. He's funnier than my last boyfriend. Another way to compare two things is to use more or less.
Okay. For an apartment comparable to yours here in the States, you would pay 40 to 50% more in Tokyo. It would cost less in the suburbs and in rural areas, of course.
You would pay 40 to 50% more in Tokyo. It would cost less in the suburbs. We use more and less when we are talking about how much something costs.
Guess how much a glass of orange juice would cost?
We also use more and less to compare long adjectives. Food in Japan is more expensive than in the States.
How much do you think a glass of orange juice would cost in Japan? 3 times more than in the United States.
We can also use better or worse to make a comparison. Better means something is superior to something else. Worse means it's inferior or not as good. The public transport is better in the cities than in the countryside. The weather is worse in the mountains than at the coast. Want to try making your own comparisons? See if you can fill in the gap here. Use the adjective below. Higher. The cost of living in Japan is much higher than in the US. Here's another one. Great! This movie is funnier than I thought. And can you think of a comparing word which fits in here? Excellent! You would pay 40% more for an apartment in Tokyo.
The cost of Japanese electronics is much higher in the United States than in Japan.
Well, how did you do? Do you feel more comfortable with making comparisons? Remember, you can compare two things by adding ER to the adjective. So quick becomes quicker, and cheap becomes cheaper. And if the adjective ends in Y, that's right, we add IER. So easy becomes easier. And of course, we also compare by using more or less, especially when we talk about how much things cost. It costs more to live in Tokyo than in the US. We also looked at using better or worse. For example, the trains are better in Japan.
It's not better or worse. It's just different.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed the lesson. See you!